Hey Eric, good morning. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm so excited to talk to you because you have so much to talk about. You have so much going on right now in the world of Sourhouse, right?
Oh my gosh, yes. Like every day, I'm like quivering with excitement and terror.
Yeah, and terror. Well, before we get into that, we're definitely going to talk a lot about that. But first, I want to hear about your beginnings with sourdough. Like, how did you? I love to hear how people found sourdough in the beginning. So, you want to share your story?
Sure. I had tried baking a few times when I was a younger man, and with no success. I tried to make a sourdough starter once and failed. And this was like pre-internet stuff, and then I watched that Netflix show. I think it's called Cooked. It's like by Michael Pollan, and
Yeah,
there's like four sections to it. One's about air, and it's about fermentation, but it focuses on sourdough. And I never really connected the dots between the idea of fermentation and bread and through and sourdough before seeing that, and that really fascinated me. Fermentation, I just think is like this, it's the closest thing to magic that we have access to. We're just like calling the forces from the universe down and making these potions and stuff. And so I was working at home. This was like pre-COVID, but I was working at home as a consultant, and so I had time to kind of fool around in my kitchen between meetings, and so I made a starter, and it took me a month, but I kind of stuck through it, and I just read everything and watched all the YouTube videos I could at that point, and eventually got through that phase and started making some bad loaves, and then made some better loaves, but was very proud of all of it. And just kind of got to a place where I was just really kind of happy to be able to like make food for my family and just be like, my young son at that time will never have to eat store-bought bread again if I don't want. And I just felt like that was healthier, and there was a lot of like pride in that. And
yeah, I absolutely love that too. When I all three of my kids have started eating sourdough at age 6 months. And I think they might get like Wonder Bread sometimes at daycare, but besides that, I don't think they would even know what it was.
yeah,
Like we do eat whole wheat bread and sourdough, but yeah, the Wonder Bread just doesn't exist in my house just for that reason. I've
yeah,
luckily
totally.
had the experience with sourdough before they were born. So
Yeah,
it helped open my eyes to that.
yeah, and kids love it. They just like they eat it up. So
Yeah, yeah,
it's
they
really
absolutely do. So you
a lot of
made
fun.
some loaves, some were good, some were bad. Are you still baking today?
Oh yeah, I've been a little busy lately with the Sour House stuff, but I've been, yeah, kicking out some focaccias and some pizzas for family, or like when we've gone over to hang with somebody lately. So I've been using it as like gifting and just kind of like treats for the family mostly. But yeah, I'm still baking regularly. I kind of like have a process now where in a typical week, I tend to just kind of create a bucket of dough, and I'll make a loaf or two, initially, and then I'll just let some sit, and then that'll end up being another loaf or two, or some pizzas or something like that.
Yeah,
Actually,
that's
yeah,
oh
go ahead.
no, sorry. I was going to ask you because I've actually never made focaccia before, and I know generally the process, but can you kind of walk the listeners through that? Like if you make, is it the same dough as your sourdough? Do you do anything differently?
Yeah, I'm pretty loosey goosey about this stuff. So
Yeah,
like
me too.
I I think that any dough, whatever typical dough you're comfortable with, probably makes a pretty good flatbread. And I'll use it for pizza, I'll use it for focaccia, whatever. I think you can add a little bit of oil to those types of doughs, to maybe like 10%, or 20%, something like that, if you want to soften it up a bit. I also think that with focaccia, people tend to like it when it's saltier. So usually I'm shooting for like a 2% or less ratio of salt with a normal loaf, but I'll just like up that, by a couple point something percentages when I'm weighing it out on my scale,
Yeah.
or just be a little bit sloppy with measurements or whatever. And and then I'm usually salting it kind of heavily on the end, because people, maybe it's because there tends to be other ingredients in it. But then, yeah, I think the nuances with focaccia I've been learning is like one is size, like, and the size and kind of like proportion to the ingredients. So if you could do like really thick focaccia, like tall, thick focaccia, it tends to be a bit milder in context to the ingredients you put on it. Whereas if you
Okay.
do a thinner one, tends to be a little bit more flavorful because the ingredients have a larger presence, like the toppings and such. And then the and I think that the kind of toppings and how you go about it, transforms it quite a bit.
Yeah. What kind of toppings do you put on them?
My go-to, I picked up from, oh man, I can't think of her name off the top of my head. She's an Instagram person who moved to Florida and bakes. But anyways, I usually like a garlic oil. It's like the oil for it. So
Oh,
I'll like kind of like soak some garlic in olive oil, slightly warmed oil for a bit. I'll use that as the oil in the pan that I kind of like spread it out in. And then I'll take the garlic bits and I'll put that on top. I use that a lot, and that's very flavorful. And
that
then,
sounds amazing.
yeah, and then I will um and then I will kind of go from there. I kind of like whatever's around. Like I'll use cherry tomatoes and onion and stuff like that.
Right.
Things that are more like primavera type concepts. But my favorite is probably taking that oil, doing very thinly sliced potato, like on a mandolin kind of thin, soaking that into with some salt and perhaps some of that garlic oil for a little bit, and then putting that kind of on the top, and then maybe dusting it with like some like smoked paprika or something like that. So you get kind of this like slightly smokier garlicky potatoy kind of bread thing.
That sounds
Um,
amazing. I never would have thought to put potatoes on focaccia, but now my mind is like reeling. That sounds delicious.
yeah, it's great. It's a big crappie. I have to say, like, I I'm not somebody that shoots for the perfect loaf. I like have a kind of a belief in the like a good enough loaf is like my target. And but I but I like my loaves in general, but focaccia seems to be the crowd pleaser. People really
Yeah.
always like that.
Yeah. And that's actually, it brings me to a kind of a tangent that I tend to go off on often is the social media perpetuating this idea that our loaves need to be perfect and our bread needs to look a certain way. I've heard from so many people that they want this exact loaf when they're starting out, and I tell them like it takes time to get there, it takes experience, and also if you want to aim for that and that's your own personal goal, that's great. We can help you get there, but that's not the perfect loaf. The perfect loaf is the loaf that works for you. And so
Yeah.
you just kind of touched on that. Like I love that idea. So is that something that you've seen too? And you have a pretty big presence on social media. You're on Instagram, currently promoting Goldie, which we're going to talk about in a second. But have you seen that too? Do you feel like sometimes there's this like a false need to shoot so high with sourdough?
Yeah, I think we go through stages because it is a kind of like mysterious and complicated process at first, and there's like this learning curve. So I think, on one hand, to find a motivation to kind of just figure it out when it's really not that complicated. It's kind of simplified. It becomes simpler pretty quickly if you push through those
Hmm.
first few steps. But I think that like finding something to like aspire for and something that really fascinates you helps you get through that period. So I can see the value in it, and I think certainly like Instagram and like some of the like beautiful creative loaves that people are creating and taking very nice photos of and sharing, can set a kind of a standard that may be a kind of a like unattainable standard for many of us parents who are like trying to take care of homes and bake some bread on the side. The um, but I think it's the most important thing is you have fun with it. My collaborator at Sourhouse, for instance, Jenny, she I kind of introduced her to sourdough, and she like got fascinated with it, and created a starter and then started making her own bread. And she's a designer and she's like a perfectionist, and she has very high standards and like for anything she makes. And so she just assumed her first loaf was going to be like perfect, and
Right.
when it was not, it like really kind of got to her, and like that's when she became super serious, and like and not long
So
after that.
she took that as a motivation and not,
Oh
it
yeah.
didn't make her want to quit. It was like, no, I'm
No.
going to get this.
Yeah, and she was just like, oh, this is not as easy as I thought, and like and then she, doubled down, and she went after the tartine loaf, and she got it, she figured it out, and she makes lovely loaves now. But I find sourdough baking, it's like it can be as easy or as like complicated as you want it to be, but it's a very deep kind of hobby. There's like a lot of rabbit holes to go down. I think it's fascinating. You never fully have control over it, and you can geek out about shaping, you can geek out on scoring, you can think about fermentation in real like scientific or kind of mystical ways. People like me who have been kind of thinking about starters a lot, there's a whole kind of world of that. And then certainly you can, mill your own flours. You can kind of think about like working with exotic kind of starters. Like there's just so much to play with. So
Yeah.
it's, I think that maybe people go through a phase of kind of perfectionism, and there's a little bit of a culture around that. But I think if you keep going, eventually you find your place in the thing. And it's just, hopefully people just have fun.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, that's a good point. It does give people something to aspire to. I just, for me, I just wish that people wouldn't see it as like the gold standard. Because
Yeah.
for, that's the message I like to kind of spread is like, the only gold standard is the one that you set for yourself.
Yeah. And like the good enough in my mind, the good enough loaf is the one that you're happy with, and it's going to be better than anything you buy at the store. So
Yeah.
that's not really that high of a bar. Like once you get the basics down, you're going to be like thrilled with the basic loaves that you're creating, and how far you want to go beyond that, it's really up to you.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. And so we talked about Jenny a little bit. Let's talk a bit about Sourhouse and about Goldie. So Erik and Jenny are working really hard right now. They are currently in the launch process of their brand new product called Goldie. I'll let Erik talk a little bit about that, but just real quick, how did you and Jenny meet? Because you mentioned that you introduced her to sourdough. So how do you know
Yeah.
Jenny, and how did you guys come up with this idea?
We've actually been friends for many years. Both of my wife and her partner went to college together, so we met through them. I used to live in New York. I'm now in North Carolina, but she's still in Brooklyn, and so living in New York, we just kind of knew each other and kind of hung out.
Right.
But when COVID hit, I packed up my family. We went to stay with some in-laws in Florida. And I was like reaching out to a bunch of different folks just to kind of like talk about the world, and we like, what are we going to do with ourselves? And so Jenny was one of the people I started having conversations around. We were talking about design and kind of products and storytelling, la la la, and we started talking about sourdough because I had been baking, and and I noticed that like, oh my gosh, this thing is trending, and it's like this big deal right now.
The
And
pandemic sourdough bakers, I love them.
yeah, and
Yes.
so I told her all about that.
Oh, that's great. That's awesome. And then you started just brainstorming, hey, like I'm having this problem with my starter, or was it more like where is there need in sourdough and how can we fill it?
Yeah, it wasn't as broad as like, I want to create a sourdough business or something like that. It was more, I'd been baking for a while. I'd noticed a variety of like sourdough is challenging in lots of different ways because it
Yeah.
can be complex. And I noticed that in my baking, even before I escaped to Florida, that my starter was living this wandering life. It was always kind of like it was floating around my little apartment in Brooklyn, just like always looking for a warm spot. And once I kind of got through the basic kind of like how to make a loaf of bread kind of questions, that phase, I started to think about this piece of like, why my starter is always doing this. And and it was also kind of annoying my wife, because it would end up in weird places and it would tend to
Yeah.
attract kind of clutter and stuff. And I realized that the problem wasn't so much the starter as it was my thermostat. Is like generally, I think most people tend to, at least in the Americas, like tend to live in kind of like 68, 70 degree kind of temperature homes. And if you have AC and heat, you kind of regulate that all year round. And and that's just a little bit too cold for starter. Starter is most active in this kind of like what we call the Goldilocks zone of like 75, 82 degrees. And so I kind of realized that the simplest thing you can do to make healthy starter is really not to futz around with flour and ratios and stuff, but just to warm it up 10 degrees. When I was trying to create my own starter for the first time, I mentioned it took me a month. It was taking forever, but the way that I finally got it to finish was to just warm it up, because I realized that I started it in the spring when it was like 65 degrees in my apartment, and it was just cold and going slow. And like once I found a way to kind of add some warmth to it, it suddenly got a lot more active, right? And
Right.
it's like, and those are the things you don't quite realize when you're just starting off baking. But once you do it for a little bit, temperature becomes much more important. And so I just was starting to think about like this idea of like, well, how do you warm your starter efficiently? I know there's just a few products on the market that are more geared towards like proofing larger batches of dough, and then there's all kinds of DIY approaches to kind of warming things, right? You put it in the microwave with a cup of hot water, or in the oven, or whatever, and they've all got problems. They work okay, but but sometimes there's accidents, and they're inefficient. And so I just had this idea for something that could be a warm spot for a starter. And when I started talking to Jenny, she's an industrial designer. So we were kind of giving each other feedback on a variety of ideas. She was thinking about like this project related to knitting, and I was thinking about sourdough stuff as well as some other things. And I had some basic drawings, and it was really just like, it was just useful kind of like looking at it through her eyes as somebody who didn't bake. And and as she kind of learned more about the problem, the kind of like the challenges of baking in general, I think and also the interest that was in sourdough at the moment, but also just how friendly and supportive the sourdough community is in general. Like that kind of mix of context, I think she realized like, oh, there's something here. And from a product design point of view, I think she became a bit fascinated with the idea of like creating the right object to solve this problem for a group of people. And I, as like a home baker who also have a background in marketing and kind of fascinated with like communities, like I was just like, oh, I think that there's people that this could really help, and like they're all getting together trying to solve this, but I think this might be something that's useful. So we just started working on it together, and we just kept working on it. And it's been 2 years now. It took longer than we thought, but we're just now getting to the point where we're kind of announcing it and telling people about what we made.
Yeah, this is the really exciting part. And I feel like, an industrial designer and a marketer, you guys are like the dream team for coming up with a brand new product. So, I mean, I think we talked about this recently, but for me, as like someone who doesn't have any experience in either of those things, having an idea in your brain and then having it in your hands as a physical product, like whatever happens in the middle there, to me is a complete total mystery. It's like shrouded in mystery. Like it's like magic. Like, oh, I want this, and then it shows up. Like, so how does it actually happen step by step? Like, can you walk us through, like, how do you get the prototypes? How are they created? All that stuff. I think maybe some listeners are thinking, I have this idea for this, but I don't know how it gets from A to Z. So can you walk us through that process a little bit?
Yeah. We can talk about it broadly, but it's like not simple, and it's always gonna be different, and you kind of just have to start, and push through it. That's probably my big advice for these things. But I so you have an idea, and I think you need to figure out with any new product and like a new brand, it's like, what is the thing, who's it for, and why would those people care about it? And that's like the simplest like kind of framework. When I'm working with like consultants on marketing, I often will like give them that. And if you are somebody who participates if you are one of your potential audiences, like you're a user of the thing you want to make, then you have a good starting place because you can understand the needs in a very personal way. But don't get too caught up in that, because that may also lead you down the wrong path. And so in my case, I was like, oh, I know I want to warm up starter. I had some initial kind of ideas about how that might work, but I'm not an engineer or designer. So, but I had some theories, and then I kind of knew my initial thought was this was for new sourdough bakers, people who wanted to create a starter for the first time.
Okay.
I ended up deciding that might not be the first audience, but maybe a second audience later on. I can talk about that. But and then, so why they need it. Well, we all know active starter is like essential to like great bread. And like, it just felt like I knew like people have this problem. It'll help people bake better bread. I kind of felt like comfortable with that. So I started to just test the like notion of, in this case, because I was trying to figure out how to warm things, I just created some Frankenstein prototypes that were made by like taking different types of like heating implements and containers and insulation, and started doing tests. And I would just test starter, doing like A/B tests, like one control on the counter, and then one, like I'd started testing DIY methods, like I actually measured the impact of like putting it in the microwave with water. I took the temperature of the water and the starter over periods of like every 15 minutes, that kind of thing. I took the various kind of heating bases and kind of flipped a glass vase over the top and like controlled that as like a Frankenstein kind of idea of what eventually became Goldie, the thing that we made. And it just kind of created a whole series of these tests to kind of understand, one, what temperature, how does temperature affect starter and its rise? How quickly does that, how does that affect time? What is the kind of the quality of the starter? And just observed and try to make it scientific, and try to create a record of it. And it proved a variety of things for me. My intuition that it's like you didn't have to give it a lot of heat, but just the right amount of heat consistent over a period of time is actually better than a lot of heat. A lot of times you put your starter in the microwave with a cup of boiling water and it's like too hot, and it kind of creates this like overly acidic kind of burnout starter too quickly.
Oh, interesting. And then I would imagine too that would cool down over a period of time too. So it's really hot in the beginning and then it cools.
Yeah, so you just get these weird things that are not quite optimal, right? And so through that, I started to look at different kind of forms. And initially I was trying to do something that was not electronic, that was more like just built around materials. Eventually I kind of realized that this had to be an appliance, like a plug-in appliance to kind of do what we needed to do. And thinking about things like transparency, it's so important to all of us to be able to see our starter, to watch it rise and so on. And but most insulated devices, when you think of like a thermos or even some of the proofers that exist, they all have thick, or kind of like opaque materials, like you can't see inside really well and understand what's going on. So I kind of had this early intuition that we wanted to make this out of glass, and that in itself has set up a big challenge for us. So it was getting through those basic things, just proving the rough concepts through Frankenstein things, which takes some time but no money. That's I think a first stage. Then thinking about Jenny was able to kind of start to take basic concepts I came up with, and she started to do early drawings and kind of take my basic crude sketches and start to give them kind of a something that's more refined, a sense of identity. And we started to land on elements early on of we have this glass cloche that covers the thing, and there's a little round handle on the side, and that was a discovery. We're okay, so maybe it's kind of cute because it has this little handle on the side that I think kind of looks like an ear or something. It's things like that start to show up. So we kind of got to a rough place. She was able to mock it up, and then we started to really do two things. So they started to talk to bakers and friends and just be like, hey, I have this idea, this thing might work. Here's how it would roughly look. Here's how it would live in your life. We started to kind of define what it would do. And we just started to ask people what they thought of it and got really early feedback. And from that, and we did cycles of this over and over and over to refine what it was and how it would work for people. So that's the product creation kind of idea stuff is kind of that phase. But then also you have to figure out how to produce it. So we started, I knew early on that we wanted to launch this through Kickstarter. Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform. It helps creators who have an idea bring together a group of people to help fund the first round of production of that idea, and to get access to the first of these products that get created, often at a discount. And so I knew, I have personal connections to people who worked at Kickstarter. I knew that was a powerful platform. So I knew that was the way we wanted to kind of introduce it to the world. So when we started looking for help with producing it, I started to reach out to Kickstarter creators who had been successful and created products kind of like this in the past, maybe made of glass or were, kind of food products, and to get advice. And some of them pointed me towards different resources for like factories and producers that you can reach out to. And there's all kinds of decisions you have to make around where you want to produce things, if those places have the capacity to produce them at the scale you want to do. Obviously cost is a factor. And you can work with factories directly, or you can work with there's like a layer of businesses on top of factories that will kind of, they'll even design things for you. If you're not a designer, you can go to them and say, hey, this is the idea, design me a version of this. But they'll also be the kind of like the lead manufacturer. They'll kind of like oversee the manufacturing process and farm out and collect the components and bring things together for you. Okay. So we went through a process of finding a partner like that. Mm-hmm. We ended up finding one that had a lot of experience in kitchen kind of stuff, and they work with brands like Weber and so on. So we trusted that they kind of had experience doing what we wanted to do, working with glass, working with heating, but also could kind of produce stuff at scale, where we could take our kind of idea and kind of make it bigger with the potential of success. And, the way that Kickstarter campaigns don't work is when people fail to deliver. So we were really keen on we want to come up with a very good prototype before we launch the campaign, which is where we're at now. And we want to feel like we have the operations and the kind of production capacity to actually deliver the thing in the time frame that we want to deliver it. So having that stuff is also a whole nother kind of piece of kind of building this out. And then you have to figure out how to market it and sell it and do all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Oh my, it's been a lot of work, right? It's been a labor of love.
Oh yeah.
This entire time for both of you.
Yeah. I think that it's for us it's nights and weekends. Last year I was essentially a stay-at-home dad, homeschooling my oldest, and so it was just we would talk one or two times a week, have a meeting and kind of run through stuff and be emailing things. And it certainly would have happened faster if it wasn't happening in the middle of COVID, when I was doing this kind of part-time because of being a dad and stuff. Mm-hmm. But I had assumed it would take 3 months to get to the place where we get can do this. Yeah. And then about a year I thought okay, we're finally there. And we actually launched the Sourhouse kind of brand and started an Instagram channel at that point, did some things. And but then the prototype wasn't quite ready, and getting the glass right, getting the lights and how the lights kind of work exactly right, those things just take lots of refinement over and over and over. And so it just takes time.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about that. How many early prototypes did you have up until this prototype?
I would say, I don't know if you just heard that, there was a big crash, but I would say that we probably is dozens, it was in the dozen space.
Wow.
There's a whole large batch of the Frankenstein ones, right? So it's ranging from I was insulating some early ones with tin foil and a wool cap, it was just I was just trying all kinds of different things, right? Yeah, so there's just lots of those. And then we started to progressively crank out ones that were using 3D modeling. They create a base using 3D modeling. They create a variety of these glass cloches, and they're essentially the first ones are basically handmade, and because you can't, you have to create these mold when you're doing things at a factory level. You create molds, and like
Yeah.
the molds are actually one of the big expenses of creating a new product. So we didn't want to spend the tens of thousands of dollars to create these molds right away. So you create like temporary molds, or they do things by hand. And then so we could kind of like test out the way that thing operates and just prove the concept that it does what we want it to do.
Right.
And then it's every now and again we would get some of those samples sent to us, and we would test them out, and we'd show people. And so it's just like being able to like, how bright are the lights? Can you see the lights from the other side of the kitchen? Like questions like that. Like you just have to get a prototype, look at it, and then get feedback, and then try to like make the next one better. And sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail, and you kind of keep doing that,
Yeah. So in my, very naive mind, I imagined like you had maybe 3 or 4 prototypes, but no, it's in the dozens. That's crazy.
Yeah. And it could be a lot more, it's like, but we are making something really, it's new. It's like,
Yeah.
there's like, it's a simple device, but it does something, specific that is meant to fill a particular need. And so it just took time to kind of refine it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to describe Goldie to people who are listening. So Goldie is basically, if you put your fingers and thumb together and make a circle, that's about how big the base is. And it sits on your countertop. I have a prototype in my kitchen actually right now, which I love. It sits on your countertop and it plugs in to the wall. And it's that small. It's about an inch tall, the base. And it's got 2 lights on the front. There's a power light, and then there's a bigger light that turns different colors. And so if it's a blue light, it means that your starter or the environment is too cold. It's below the Goldilocks zone, like Erik mentioned, right? 68 to, no, sorry.
Below 75 degrees, yeah.
Yeah. What is it? 75 to 82?
That's the Goldilocks zone.
Okay, yes, thank you. Oh, it's Monday morning. So that in that case, if it's in that zone, it'll turn gold. And so that's indicative that you're in the Goldilocks zone. And then if it's too warm, it'll be red, which I'm assuming then the heat kicks off, right?
Yeah. So we describe Goldie as a warm, safe home for your sourdough starter. And it's just meant to be this little container that you keep on your counter, and you put your starter in. You can use whatever typical starter jar you use. We're also making some jars. But the idea is you put it in there. It's the top is clear, so you can always see it. And if you turn the auto warming function on, the bottom front light comes on to tell you that it's on. And then basically that puts a kind of a floor below 75 degrees. And so if the environment is such that, say your house is 68 degrees, Goldie will gently warm the environment right there around your starter to keep it up in that like 75, 82 degree zone. And so the lights, the top lights that you're referring to, which is a very simple thermometer. It's just always telling you what is the temperature kind of around that platform where your starter sits. And so if you have the auto warming off and your room is 68 degrees, you'll see blue. But if you turn the auto, and if your house happens to be 78 degrees, you'll see gold. It just tells you these simple, like, is my starter kind of a little chilly and sluggish? Is my starter right now probably viewing the world as like perfect and I feel active, or is my starter viewing the world as like a little too hot? I'm getting a little overexcited and perhaps a little acidic and hard to work with. And so when you turn Goldie on, it just makes sure that you don't allow your starter to drop down into that blue zone. It keeps it in that Goldilocks zone of the gold color. And the only reason you'll probably ever see red is if you have, if your AC goes out, or if you just happen to live in a place that can get hot and your environment gets above 82 degrees. And at that point, yeah, Goldie turns off. It can never like overheat your starter. It's designed to just keep it in that zone. We did create a kind of a manual way for this occasions when if your home does get too hot, to try to bring the temperature back down. We call it a cooling puck, like a Sourhouse cooling puck. It's a thing you keep in the fridge or in the freezer. So it's frozen. It's just like a little round puck about the size of the lid on a mason jar, on like a pint-sized mason jar. And it's frozen. You bring it out if it gets too hot. You just put it on top of your jar underneath our glass cloche. And then the cool air from that frozen puck kind of drifts down to your starter inside of Goldie, and it brings the temperature down. And if you leave the auto warming function on, with Goldie, that maintains that kind of floor 75 degrees. So between that gentle heat that comes on as needed and that cool air that comes down from the puck, you actually can bring your starter back into the Goldilocks zone, even when your kitchen is like, 85 degrees, 90 degrees, whatever's going on, for at least an hour or two. It depends on the temperature, maybe longer in my tests. And then you can always switch out pucks with other pucks if for some reason you need to extend it. But one puck should be sufficient for like prepping a starter for baking.
Right. Wow. So it's literally about temperature control. That's what this
Yeah,
is. And I've heard before too that we need to look at temperature as an ingredient with bread. So I feel like you guys are kind of nailing that.
absolutely. I think that we don't think about temperature enough. And there's a lot of things to think about at first. And like I said, like this is why I don't think when I was originally thinking about this product, I think that the people who are going to appreciate this the most are people who've been baking for like 6 months or so.
Mhm.
And if you started baking during COVID, you're probably ready for it about now. It can be used to start a new starter, and it certainly will help. But you may not understand why it's so valuable and like what it spared you from if you used it. Because I think that like you kind of at some point maybe learn about like the dough temperature and how that changes the pace that things proof. Like controlling the temperature around starter controls its flavor, how active it is, and thus that quality carries over into the bread that you make in later stages. It's also about controlling time. It's like I think temperature and time are deeply linked, and a lot of I think as you progress as a baker, you learn that you have various levers to control time, to get your schedule under control, and to make it work for you. So you're not kind of like obligated to some kind of standard recipe.
Mhm.
And that's when you really become free as a baker to kind of like make it fit into your lives and to kind of like enjoy it, because you're working over a long time frame, even though it doesn't take a lot of time, to like to do stretch and folds or whatever. But to be able to make it fit into your life and still create the kind of bread you want to create, having more control over time is really essential. And so Goldie is really a way to kind of make sure that your starter's ready at a consistent time, whenever you want to do it, so you can kind of plan your time a little bit more efficiently. And then also it speeds things up. If you're in a cold environment, it will, especially like right now, we're talking like in early spring, and I know a lot of parts of the United States is still quite cold, and your starters probably be feeling kind of sluggish, and
Mhm.
so if you want to like bake some bread without having to work way into the into the evening, having something like this really makes a difference.
Yeah, and you can watch your starter really closely in it as well and learn when exactly it's going to peak, and it will peak at that amount of hours every single time because you have that temperature constant. That temperature variable is held constant. So
Yeah,
you can make your schedule, like you said, really around that. And because sometimes it varies depending, of course, on the water temperature, on your ambient air temperature. So that's amazing to be able to say, my starter in Goldie will peak in 5 hours.
yeah,
That's like, and with plus or minus maybe 15, 30 minutes, but that's
yeah.
amazing. That's the accuracy that we've never seen with starter before.
Yeah, and some people get 4 hours, and people, it's like you'll have to learn what it is with your starter, because there are lots of variables. But I think for anybody, particularly if you're still a kind of a young baker, it's like controlling variables is key to like wrapping your head around this. And
Yes.
so you don't want to like try to do everything. And when you make changes, you want to make one change at a time to kind of learn. And
Yes.
the fun of, I think, sourdough baking is that you will just keep learning as much as you want to put into it. And Goldie, I think it's just like a great learning device too. It's like just the lights, even if you have the auto warming function off because you're just like not going to be baking right now, you're just happy with your starter hanging out at room temperature or whatever. The temperature lights are always on, and so it's always telling you like how a starter is perceiving the environment. And so you start to realize like, oh, I can't just project my own kind of temperature needs on my starter. We are very different creatures, and
Yes.
so I think that understanding that mind shift of like, oh, my starter likes to be at the spa, and like I, like at all times, and I maybe like it a little cooler, and just starting to kind of understand that, you understand your starter better. And I think one of the things I see talking to really good bakers is like they all understand their starter very well. And that's like one of those things that separate, I think, the really good bakers from the bakers like me, or just like kind of doing good
Yeah.
enough work.
And me, I'm like,
Yeah.
ish.
Yeah.
Yeah, they know it to a T though. They know
Yeah.
the exact time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's God, that's so interesting. And so I currently, like you said, we're talking in early spring, and you guys are doing a campaign on Sourhouse on your Instagram, which is what's your Instagram handle?
Life at Sourhouse.
Right. So you can find them over at Life at Sourhouse, but they're doing a campaign right now with these really cool cartoony drawings of one a day of different techniques you can use to warm your starter, but the manual DIY methods. And of course, they all come with the risk of catastrophic failure. And I've heard so many stories on the Sourdough Mamas group about, my husband turned on my oven and it cooked my starter. The only solution I ever have is like when you put it in there, write on a sticky note, starter in oven, and put it right over the controls so no one can turn it on. But sometimes you forget to do that. So what are some other crazy stories that you've kind of heard and seen in putting this campaign together? Because it's easy to like laugh at it, but when it happens to you, it's like truly devastating.
Yeah, I think that and that's the big thing is like with Goldie, we want to lower the stress of sourdough baking and take away the at least the concern around your starter. It's simple. You just stick it in there, turn it on, and you have a nice, safe, warm spot.
Right.
I think anybody who has kids is probably concerned about kids or pets like getting into their starter and it kind of like ending up on the floor, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've certainly heard a lot, and I think the thing you hear most are variations around either the starter getting cooked somehow. The oven is the most common. My mom told me one where her starter she put it on like the water heater, but then like took a shower and did some laundry or whatever. The thing started really going, and it just like fried it for some
Oh
reason.
no,
And
that's a new one. I haven't heard that one before.
yeah, and then the other thing I think is hygiene. Like starters getting too warm. If they get too warm, they get a little bit more susceptible to invading bacteria and yeast that you don't want in there, and you can end up with weird stuff. And so I think that I've heard stories about people getting like that cam yeast stuff or other kinds of pink mold, things like that, because they either lived in an environment that's too warm or were keeping it somewhere that's too hot. That's one of the big concerns. I've tried playing with like those reptile mats, for instance. I used some of those as warming devices when I was doing my tests, and like they work okay, but like they produce a lot of heat real quickly and then back off, and it comes on and off constantly to kind of like maintain that target temperature you want. And like I don't really want my starter being exposed to big spikes of heat,
Sure.
because that's like pushes it up into that space where I feel like you're going to get a little bit more vulnerable. You're going to become a little bit more vulnerable to invaders in that space, even if you're there for little moments of time. So like that's the other thing I hear about a lot. But yeah, we're doing 30 days of ways to not warm your starter, and yeah, we're trying to have some fun with that and try to like catalog the many ways people have experimented with and maybe exaggerate how they can fail a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's really fun, and I love it because it's real. We've all had sourdough struggles. We've all, hopefully not all, lost our starter at one point. But I want to take this opportunity to tell people to go right now, like pause the podcast right now and go and dry some starter for your backup emergency, because something will probably happen at some point. Like I went on vacation and it was like 6 days into my vacation, and I realized my starter was still on my counter, and my brother was house sitting for me, and I had to just have him put it in the fridge. I completely forgot about it. So it was on my counter for like 6 or 7 days without being fed. So I can't, and it was fine, luckily, but it was close. That's the closest I've ever come to completely losing a starter. So go and dry your starter right now. And so if anything like this happens to you, you can just pull that and reactivate it, and then you'll have your starter back. So gosh, I feel like you and Jenny have been through the ringer with this thing. I'm so excited to see it on Kickstarter. I'm so excited to be part of this with you. Looking back, I love to ask this question. Would you have done anything differently?
Wow, I think that I'm really proud of where we ended up. Like, I think that like I had a pretty clear intuition of like what this thing should be, how it would work, who it was for, but then you just can't not go through the process. And it is so valuable to have good um, people with you when you go on these trips. And so we got a lot of good advice. But I say like I couldn't have done it without Jenny because she just brought a whole different world of expertise. Like I've worked for companies where we've, produced things in factories before and so on, but like she has an ability not only to create designs and create the like, the schematics of things, but to like then talk to manufacturers and ask the right questions and understand how processes are created to make things at scale. And so that would have been way harder without a partner like that. And she's brought a lot of kind of visual aesthetics and to the project that have really helped make it what it is. So it's just been, I'm really, I would love to have it happen faster, but like I think that the process we went through was really essential for learning what we needed to learn and to learn how to work together and to kind of just build out a kind of a the beginnings of an organization where we can actually feel confident that we can kind of deliver to people, deliver the experience that we say we're going to deliver. So I could have probably said one thing different is we would love to have had $1 million to invest in this and from the beginning, and it would have been great to have an actual engineer as like maybe a third partner because that would have answered some of the questions that we had a lot faster. Because I don't know how to do the math of like, if you put this much heat against a certain substance, how fast that substance is going to change temperature, things like that.
Right.
Like I had to do manual tests to just like empirically observe it, whereas probably somebody could have just done some math
Yeah.
and figured it out. But so that would have been probably something to do different. And then, I don't know, because we're still in this hopeful moment. Like, we're talking right now, I think people are going to hear about this like at the end of March. We are just now building that kind of like coalition of people like sourdough bakers. A lot of people have given us feedback and helped us so far, but we're trying to expand that now and find the people that are like excited about this idea, want to see it come into the world, feel like it's a thing that should exist. And but it's still an open question. Like, we think this is going to be useful. We think people with their chili starters need a safe, warm spot to warm it up, but we don't know. And so we're going to find that out soon. And, I may have, hopefully we can navigate this effect, well, and we can make good choices. And so hopefully when we talk again in a couple months, like I'll be like, oh yeah, no regrets. This is perfect. But I don't know. We'll see,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, hindsight is always 2020, right?
Yeah.
But I think, like I told you already, but I pulled out the prototype. You told me it was a prototype from the box, and I was expecting something really rough, and it's a beautiful product. It really is. And so I'm really excited for this, and I'm really happy to be on board.
I appreciate that.
Yeah. How can everybody find you to help to fund you? Where should they head after they hear this podcast?
Yeah, so you can go to our website, sourhouse.co /Goldie. There's a sign up page right now. If you, so we're in a couple weeks before the Kickstarter campaign will launch. If you sign up now in advance of that launch, you will get included on like a VIP list where you'll get a notification when we launch, and you will get the chance at a very significant discount to the rest of the world. So if you hear this early enough, I really encourage you to go to sourhouse .co /Goldie. And then once the Kickstarter campaign kicks off, that site will just forward to Kickstarter for the period of the campaign, but you'll be able to find Goldie by Sourhouse on Kickstarter and to back us and to get the Goldie of your dreams and and maybe we haven't really talked about our jars, but we'll also have some of our starter jars available too.
Oh, that's so awesome. So great. So I'm really excited to see what happens with this, where this takes you, what happens to Goldie. I completely can see her on countertops worldwide. It's just so practical, and it's such a great idea. So it's amazing that you came up with this. So congratulations for getting this far.
Thank you. I like your vision. I like this worldwide counters. Goldie's on counters everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah, every counter in the world. Because I have heard too some people baking sourdough in hot and humid places like Southeast Asia where it's very hot, and so they would benefit from something like a cooling puck. So I think it's practical and usable anywhere that you live. So it's
Absolutely.
really great. So head on over, guys, to sourhouse.co/Goldie. Get your name on that list for the launch and get a huge discount on Goldie if you're listening early enough. And if not, then Goldie hopefully is out there in the world and you can just Google her and find her on an online shop.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
The
Yeah.
power of positive thinking. I'm really
There you
excited
go.
for you, Erik. This is so great. And Jenny too. I wish she could have been here for this interview, but we're really excited for you guys.
Yeah. Thanks so much. I appreciate coming on, talking with you, and just trying to introduce, this is honestly the first podcast first time we've really talked about this publicly with anybody. So it's like your community is the first to know, and I'm glad we were able to do it with you.
Super VIP. Did you hear that, Sourdough Mamas? You're super VIP for Goldie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Erik. This is so exciting. And yeah, we'll check back with you in a few months and see where you're at.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Have a great day. Bye.
You too. Bye.